Hello history buffs, time travelers and scholars. In the Wild West, justice was often rough and unforgiving. Lawmen and townspeople didn't hesitate to punish outlaws with some of the harshest methods imaginable. From public hangings to brutal whippings, the frontier wasn't a place for second chances. This article dives into the punishments that were feared across the West. The dark side of justice in the Wild West. In the wild and lawless American frontier, justice was often handed out in brutal public ways. Public executions, especially hangings, became central events, not only to scare criminals, but also to entertain locals. The sights and sounds of a hanging were as familiar as gunshots or galloping horses, and even infamous figures like Doc Holliday noted how these events could bring a whole town together. In the late 1800s, hangings in the West became grand spectacles, drawing crowds from far and wide. When the famous outlaw Billy the Kid was scheduled to hang in 1881, people traveled for days to witness it, though he ultimately escaped. Another well-known criminal, Cherokee Bill, faced the gallows in 1896. When asked if he had any last words, he calmly replied, "I came here to die, not to make a speech." Public hangings were designed to be as painful as possible, with prisoners often struggling for minutes before dying. One of the largest executions was in 1882, when Judge Isaac Parker, known as the Hanging Judge, ordered 6 men to be hanged at once in Fort Smith, Arkansas, drawing a crowd of thousands. Judge Parker famously said, "I never hanged a man. It is the law." For the townsfolk, hangings were almost like festivals, with vendors selling snacks, photographers capturing the moment, and children perched on their parents' shoulders for a better view. In Tombstone, Arizona, a special platform was built to allow a crowd to watch the 1884 hanging of John Millen. In some cases, crowds came from as far as other towns, like for the Olive Brothers execution in 1878 in Nebraska, where over 2,000 people, 10 times the town's population, showed up. Hell behind bars, the grim realities of Wild West prisons. The prison systems of the Wild West were far from the organized, rehabilitative institutions seen today. The Yuma Territorial Prison in Arizona, one of the era's most infamous, stood as a grim fortress against the desert's relentless heat. Inmates were crammed into small cells where temperatures reached unbearable levels, often surpassing 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet, Yuma paradoxically featured progressive touches, such as a library and classes, introduced by Superintendent Thomas Gates, who saw value in reform. In contrast, towns like Tombstone, Arizona, used primitive jails, mere holes in the ground covered by iron bars. Here, prisoners faced exposure to the elements, and tales of endurance like that of Buckskin Frank Leslie, who famously claimed hell was preferable, became part of the brutal legacy. Dodge City, Kansas, had its own makeshift structure, where notorious inmates like Clay Allison were forced to endure desperate, freezing winters and sweltering summers. Chain gangs, common across the West, epitomized hardship. Texas leased prisoners for labor, with convicts chained together in harsh conditions that bordered on slavery. The Sugar Land prison farm, for example, saw inmates toiling in sugarcane fields under brutal conditions, earning the state significant revenue at the cost of inmate suffering. Over in Colorado, chain gangs worked in treacherous silver mines, where many died due to exhaustion, disease, or mine accidents. This unforgiving life fostered a distinct prison culture and slang. Gallows became necktie parties, and freedom was called riding the owl. Ironically, some prisons adopted a trustee system, allowing well-behaved inmates certain privileges. These trustees managed roles as cooks, clerks, and even overseers, which introduced a complex power dynamic. Notorious Wild West figures like Butch Cassidy even benefited from this system, gaining trust before inevitably returning to their outlaw ways after release. One of the most excruciating punishments was the Apache Ring in New Mexico, a relentless shuffle where inmates, chained together, moved in circles until exhaustion. The chain not only tested physical endurance, but also psychological tolerance, fostering dependency and resentment among prisoners. The Wild West's prisons and chain gangs thus stand as dark symbols of frontier justice, structures of punishment meant to impose order in a lawless land, often leaving their own mark of cruelty on history. In an 1893 account, one inmate described the punishment as feeling like drowning from the inside, like being baptized in hell's own water. This brutal water cure was used not only for punishment, but also as a harsh way to force confessions, with prisoners sometimes admitting to crimes they hadn't committed just to end the suffering. The method gained a bad reputation beyond the prison walls, when Texas Rangers began using it in 1889 to interrogate outlaws. Ranger James B. Gillette employed the water cure on a suspected cattle thief near El Paso, sparking a public debate. An editorial in the El Paso Times even questioned, when does the pursuit of justice become injustice itself? One of the most memorable punishments was the jail tree in Laramie, Wyoming, used as a makeshift jail from 1868 to 1876. Prisoners were chained to a large cottonwood tree, exposed to harsh weather and public humiliation. A famous prisoner, Big Steve Long, spent 3 days chained there in 1868 before he was hanged. Boldly, he reportedly shouted to the crowd, "I'll haunt this tree long after you're all dust." The jail tree was such a local landmark that when it was struck by lightning in 1900, the Wyoming State Journal called it the only jail that never had a prisoner escape. It wasn't just criminals chained to the jail tree. In 1875, some rowdy cowboys were chained there overnight to sober up, with one local quipping that the tree had seen more stars than an astronomer. The jail tree's role ended in 1876 when a real jail was built, but its legend lived on. Bits of the tree were sold as souvenirs, with one piece even ending up in a London museum as an example of frontier justice. As the 19th century ended, the Wild West began to see signs of prison reform. The opening of the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, in 1895, introduced ideas like vocational training and a merit system for prisoners. But in many parts of the West, prison was still a harsh place where survival, not rehabilitation, was the main focus. The early 20th century saw the rise of prison rodeos, starting in the Texas prison system in 1931 at the Huntsville State Penitentiary, although similar events likely took place earlier. These rodeos featured inmate cowboys and drew crowds of spectators, combining punishment with entertainment in a way unique to the Western world. As one prisoner carved into the wall of an Arizona jail cell, "Here's to those who've seen the elephant and heard the owl. May God have mercy on our souls, for these stone walls surely won't." This marked a grim reminder of a time when justice was as wild and ruthless as the frontier itself. The words of Dostoevsky ring true here. The degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. By this standard, the Wild West truly struggled to balance justice and human dignity in an unforgiving land. Rough justice in the Wild West. Stockades, whips, and branding. In the rugged expanse of the American frontier, justice was often harsh and unyielding. The Wild West, where law struggled to keep up with rapid settlement, saw the return of ancient punishments alongside brutal new methods. Stockades, whipping posts, and branding irons became tools of order, leaving lasting marks on both the people and the country's collective memory. The stockade, a relic from colonial times, was used in Western territories as a form of public humiliation. In Tombstone, Arizona, a stockade once stood close to the famous Boot Hill graveyard, where rowdy citizens were held up for the town to see. In 1881, a man named John Slaughter was sentenced to 2 hours in the stockade for drunkenness, with a local newspaper hoping it would have a sobering effect on the town's more rambunctious citizens. Whipping posts, also a holdover from earlier times, were a common sight in Western towns. In Dodge City, Kansas, known as the wickedest little city, a whipping post stood in the town square. Marshal Wyatt Earp, who served in Dodge City from 1876 to 1879, was said to prefer this punishment for minor offenses, believing a good whipping was sometimes the best reminder of good behavior. The whipping post saw frequent use in places like New Mexico, where in 1887, a horse thief named Miguel Sandal received 39 lashes in Las Vegas, New Mexico. This punishment, delivered with vigor, was heard across town and was intended to warn would-be criminals. Perhaps the most lasting form of punishment was branding, a method commonly associated with cattle. In Texas, the law even codified it as punishment for horse theft. The Texas Penal Code of 1856 required first-time horse thieves to be branded with an H on their shoulder, and a second offense added HT on their cheek. The practice continued until 1879 and left visible scars on convicted thieves. In 1884, frustrated with cattle rustling, the Wyoming Stock Growers Association hired detectives who captured a man named Andy Ketchum. Instead of taking him to the authorities, they branded him with HT on his forehead, marking him as a horse thief despite his crime being cattle theft. This incident drew backlash even on the frontier, with a local newspaper condemning it as barbaric. Branding wasn't without its critics. Judge Roy Bean, known as the Law West of the Pecos, opposed the branding of a young horse thief in 1887, saying, "We ain't in the business of marking men like cattle." As the West began to settle, this moment of leniency hinted at a shift away from harsh physical punishments. During the Johnson County War in Wyoming in 1892, small ranchers were threatened with branding if they didn't sell their land. Nate Champion, a homesteader, faced threats of branding and, before his death, wrote in his diary, "I'd rather die a man than live branded like cattle." His stance became a powerful symbol of resistance against larger ranchers. As the 19th century came to a close, these severe punishments began to fade as more formal laws and jails were established. However, the lasting image of frontier justice, whips, brands, and stockades, was immortalized in Western novels, like The Virginian, and continues to shape how we remember the rough justice of the Wild West. The dark dance of vigilante justice in the Wild West. In the untamed stretches of the American frontier, where the formal reach of the law often fell short, justice took on a raw and brutal nature. The Wild West, a land rich with opportunity and equally rife with lawlessness, spawned a culture of vigilantism that etched an indelible mark on American history. With scarce law enforcement, ordinary citizens took it upon themselves to deliver swift and often ruthless punishment to those deemed deserving. Rise of the Montana Vigilantes. One of the most infamous examples of vigilante justice took place in Montana Territory in 1863. In the gold-rich towns of Bannock and Virginia City, a gang called the Innocents, led by Sheriff Henry Plummer, terrorized the locals. Fed up with law enforcement's inability to protect them, vigilantes seized control. On a freezing night in January 1864, Plummer and two of his deputies were strung up on gallows beams. Plummer reportedly begged for a clean drop, but the vigilantes were unmoved, and by the end of their campaign, they had executed 24 men without trial. The Montana Vigilantes' secret symbol, 3777, later became the symbol of the Montana Highway Patrol, a chilling reminder of the frontier's unflinching justice. San Francisco Vigilance Committees of 1851 and 1856. In lawless San Francisco, rampant crime and corruption led citizens to form the San Francisco Vigilance Committees of 1851 and 1856. Taking justice into their own hands, they conducted their own trials, sentenced criminals, and carried out executions. In 1856, the committee publicly hanged two notorious criminals, James Casey and Charles Cora, in front of a crowd of 15,000 onlookers. The event became a public spectacle, drawing so much attention that it reshaped the city's political landscape. William Tell Coleman, a member of the committee, declared, "We are here not to punish criminals so much as to protect ourselves." Lynchings and racial tensions. Lynchings, the darkest aspect of vigilante justice, often extended beyond criminals to racial and ethnic minorities. In 1885, Rock Springs, Wyoming, witnessed the massacre of 28 Chinese laborers by a mob of white miners. This tragedy, known as the Rock Springs Massacre, highlighted the racial animosity that fueled many mob actions. Similarly, the Chinese Massacre of 1871 in Los Angeles saw 18 Chinese men lynched by a mob of 500 after a conflict between rival Chinese gangs escalated into widespread violence against the Chinese community. First hang him, then try him. Vigilante justice was notoriously hasty, often resulting in tragic miscarriages of justice. In 1863, Josiah Beagle, a suspected horse thief, was lynched in Colorado. Just as he was hanged, a rider appeared with the very horse Beagle was accused of stealing, proving his innocence far too late. This incident popularized the saying, "First hang him, then try him." Similar fates befell others, such as the Higgins brothers in Texas, who were lynched in 1873 for supposedly stealing horses they had actually purchased legally. If you found this exploration into history insightful and want to learn more about its complex and haunting chapters, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you'll be the first to know when we dive into the next chapter of our fascinating past.